Hi everyone, and thanks for joining this session. My name is Arzuk. I'm a Marie Curie Fellow based at the UCL Social Research Institute, and currently I'm conducting a research project on changing ideas about childhood in the 1980s and 90s. Some of you might be familiar with this project. I study how ideas about childhood transformed in these decades with impacts on the status of children and childhood. But today I will be talking about a pet project of mine, again on childhood in the 1990s, but from a very different perspective. I will introduce a social responsibility project competition organized by a children's magazine to facilitate children's participation. The research is partly autobiographical because one of the primary sources is a field journal that I kept as a 10-year-old. It also involves a critical discourse analysis of various other paraphernalia, including the coverage of the competition in the magazine, an interview with me and my friends published in another magazine, and photographs from the field. But before I go on to talk about my research, let me say a few things about the historical context to situate my findings. Social history, and especially the social history of childhood in Turkey in the 1990s, is usually overlooked. And one reason for that is that the 1990s is sandwiched between the 1980s, when the military coup cleared the scene for uncontested neoliberal restructuring, and the 2000s, when the government changed hands. And the decade is also seen to the rise of radical right movements, including political Islam, and also one of the worst periods of armed conflict between the state and Kurdish rebel groups. But leaving major politics aside, politics on the street also went through a significant transformation in this decade. After the highly engaged mass politicization of the 1970s was silenced first by the coup and then dimmed with the end of the Cold War, alternative political movements began to emerge, and that included environmentalism, feminism, and human rights activism, most of which were left-wing urban movements related to but distant from the socialist movements of the previous decades. And the 1990s was not a great decade for being a child. On top of conflict and violence, it was also marked by rising inequality and sweeping demographic movements that carried the country's traditional rural-urban gap to crowded cities, coupled with the retrenchment of welfare. For the luckier minority of children, this was also the time when they were introduced to a children's rights framework and to the UNCRC. So it was in this context when Doğan Kardeş began, or rather recommenced publication. Doğan Kardeş was a very famous and iconic children's magazine that originally began publication in the 1940s, right after the end of the Second World War, but it reached its unsurpassable popularity mainly in the 1960s. The magazine was published by one of the biggest banks in Turkey, and it was named after the owner Tashkent's son, who tragically lost his life when he was studying in a boarding school in Switzerland. And devastated by this huge loss, Tashkent established a printing house for children, and he teamed with Vedat Nedim Tör, who was one of the foremost intellectuals of the era, to publish translated and original children's books as well as a magazine. From the beginning, Doğan Kardeş had been a humanitarian, democratic magazine that was aimed at the urban middle class child, though it was surely enjoyed by other children too. And it became an icon in the 1960s, but had to close down in the late 1970s when economic crisis hit printing press hard with rising prices of imported paper, and the upkeep became too costly for the bank. When Duan Kardesch was relaunched in 1989, it preserved its original promise and character, but it failed to preserve its untouchable status as the children's magazine, with too many competitors left and right, including children's television. So it became some sort of a niche high-end magazine for the children of educated urban middle classes. And it was after this relaunch when Duan Kardesch took on the duty of campaigning for children's rights. It organized a petition for the ratification of the convention. It gave out postcards to be filled and sent to the parliament. It distributed posters with the convention articles and encouraged children to learn and defend their rights. And one of those rights was, of course, the right to participate. So this was how this project came about. In September 1989, Doğan Kardeş announced a social responsibility project competition for children. The winner of the competition would have the chance to travel to New York and attend the World Children's Day celebrations in the United Nations building, all expenses covered by the magazine. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any records of the summit or celebration in UN database, but this celebration appears to be organized by a World Children's Day Foundation established by Turkish expats to oversee children's activities and community service projects, as well as an annual celebration in the UN building in New York. The competition was first announced in the magazine, but since the audience was not that big at the time, it appears that Doğan Kardeş also worked in collaboration with the Ministry of Education and UNICEF, and it also directly contacted schools to participate in the competition. The jury was composed of editors, authors, and illustrators from the publishing house, and also featured an environmental scholar and representatives from both UNICEF and the ministry. In a way, this competition was a logical continuation of Doğan Kardeş's legacy. It had always been a magazine with a mission, which was to bring up the responsible citizens for a young country. And an important part of this was to initiate children's participation. The brilliant idea they had back in the day was to create a children's public sphere with an age-appropriate focus, but away from adult supervision. And throughout the 60s and 70s, some strategies to do that were to encourage the foundation of Doğan Kardeş clubs or invite children to become members of societies, such as the Society for the Protection of Animals. And it was a successful strategy too. Many readers of the magazine later recalled these as one of the foundations of their political identities. But it was the 1990s, so the memories when politicization went out of hand were still alive. The social movements of the 70s had been too strong to be regarded as a good way of doing politics for young people. So this time, no risks were taken. The rules of the competition were clear straight from the beginning. The project would be about building a better world and a better future. And the child was a political becoming rather than a political being. The project had to be about the future. And this was unsurprising considering the hesitancy about children's involvement in politics with a capital P. So some issues were clearly off limits. So this would not be about Kurdish children demanding their linguistic rights or about child laborers going on strike. The participants were instructed to pick one of the priority areas, which were water and food waste, environment and pollution, children in need of protection, illiteracy, disability, and drug addiction. So by predetermining approved areas for children's political participation, the rules offered a specific definition of benign politics. Benign politics was either about a higher purpose, such as protecting the environment or achieving sustainability, or else it was a benevolent one that helped less lucky kids. And the political child was a savior of other children. So in other words, it was not about children demanding their own rights in the present. The sample project, for instance, was about children organizing a deposit can collection and then using the raised funds to buy toys that they would donate to a children's shelter. And furthermore, it was not only the end result of the project, but also the process that was regulated. The participants were instructed to team up with their classmates, come up with a social responsibility project, do their research, execute the project, and then send a short report of 250 words to enter the competition. Although the competition was open to collective projects carried out by groups of children, the entries needed to be submitted by individual children together with their form teachers. Thus, by linking the project to the school, it was ensured that the invitation only extended to the formerly schooled child. And moreover, since the teacher would also be a co-investigator, the whole process would be regulated and supervised by a responsible adult. The winner of the competition was a rather ingenious project of cultivating mushrooms using dried stems of crops that were usually burnt after harvesting wheat. And it was proposed by a child of scientist parents in a major Kurdish city and executed by her classmates. There were some clues about food poverty and regional disparities in the report, but overall, the emphasis was on sustainability and agriculture. The other ranking proposals were also examples of either philanthropy or environmentalism. So children's presence in the public sphere was encouraged and the children were invited to participate. And this was no small task in a country where all forms of political participation was banned only a few years ago, where strikes were made illegal and labor unions and political parties were suspended. And tens of thousands of people were tried on charges of being members of political organizations. but it was still under strict rules and limits, which resulted in a very middle class, very muted and very benign form of participation. And at first sight, it appears that children complied with the rules and played along nicely. But did they? So turning to my other primary sources, there is a parallel story written by the other actors of the story, who are the children. A group of 10-year-olds in Izmir decided to enter the competition with a community garden project. It was a very simple idea. They lived in a tightly packed urban area with no access to green space. So they wanted to transform the disused spaces in front of apartment buildings into small community gardens for children. They would personally clean up the space and then ask the municipality to plant trees and flowers and find sponsors to install a few benches so that they could meet their friends outdoors. And this was one of the honorable mentions in the competition. And I was one of those children, and I was the one who submitted this to the magazine. So I still have the file I have submitted to enter the competition, along with my diary that I have kept to record the progress, and the photographs that we took during the execution of the project. It is a very brief account, but it is also very telling. So to give you some information about these children, the project builds on a previous alliance between children, and it was not their first political act. The first was an impromptu street protest about the environment and their rights to space. The diary or the project report does not provide much detail about this protest, but interestingly, the competition entry also features an interview with the children in Sokak magazine, and there is more to be found there. Sokak magazine was a weekly political news journal and an alternative media outlet which was particularly interested in social movements, including environmental activism, labor movement, feminism, gender and LGBT movements. And it was led by Tuğrul Eryilmaz, a BBC-trained well-known journalist, as the editor-in-chief. And apparently, the idea to organize a street protest was raised following an in-class debate on environmental issues. According to the children, this gave them the idea to write placards and organize a small-scale rally. The children note that their teacher was not completely comfortable about this being a full-on protest, and she suggested that they do this in school grounds, and other people also warned them that they might clash with the police. But still, children insist to do it on the main road because they were confident of the legitimacy of their protest. And apparently, they were quite aware that environmentalism was one of the few issues that children could legitimately be political about. Although initially the focus of the interview is the protest itself, during the course, children expressed their ideas on many other issues as well. Since the magazine could not survive more than 32 issues, there is no official archive and no verbatim record of the interview. But in line with the magazine's stance, it was probably the journalist who raised several questions to encourage children to talk, and children did talk about rapid urbanization, about children's rights to play, the ongoing warfare in the country, nuclear power plants, gendered dress codes in schools, and even corporal punishment. And the theme that came up quite often was a sense of entitlement to rights and disappointment at adults who the children believed were not respecting those rights and failed to deliver their promises. So turning back to the field diary and the final report, although they are very brief, both are accounts of the variety of different control mechanisms that children had to navigate through, including the set rules of the competition and the rules of the education system. So here I would like to quote a few short sections from the diary, which I believe illustrate how children were involved in several negotiations with different adults, including their families, their teacher, the authorities, and other adults from the neighborhood. Quote, "Today we went to the municipality. We could not find the deputy mayor at his office, so we went to the Parks and Recreation Department to ask for their approval, and we were granted permission," unquote. So right away, this issue of adult approval and permission comes up, even before children set out to clear the rubbish. And this theme of acquiring legitimacy and approval is picked up again as children continue to negotiate with adults after the clearance work is done. Quote, "Today we couldn't go to the park, but we met at school. We plan to go to the municipality on Monday after school. We will ask for some saplings to be delivered," unquote. And then here is Monday's entry. Quote, "Today was the second time we went to the municipality. They told us to be at the park at 10 tomorrow. We told them that 10 o'clock is school time. They told us to get our teacher's permission. We told them we won't be allowed. They told us we would. In the end, we gave up and added that we would meet them in the park. See you tomorrow, unquote. And here is the entry for Tuesday, quote, today we couldn't go to the park because we couldn't obtain our teacher's permission. Instead, we drowned our sorrow in food after school, unquote. So again, children had to negotiate with different adults with different expectations. Their mobility is completely controlled and supervised by adults, from parents to teachers, and they actually had a firmer grasp of their limits than adults. Another tension surfaced as children clashed with adults from the neighborhood, particularly the younger apprentices who worked at the hairdressers behind the little patch they cleared out. So initially, the apprentices were happy to cooperate. They even joined in the works and lent tools. But 2 days later, they refused to repeat this. And reading between the lines, they were probably warned by their employers. Quote, today we asked for tools from the hairdressers, but instead they picked up a fight. We couldn't speak up for our rights because we were told to shut up, unquote. So here it is apparent that children believed it was their legitimate right to work on this patch because they have the permission from adult authority, but they were also very aware of their lack of power to assert their rights. The competition entry is a candid account where the children open-heartedly admit that the garden did not turn out to be what they imagined. To their frustration, the municipality decided to cover the small walking area between 2 bits of the garden with hideous concrete instead of the pretty tiles that the children asked for. And the sponsors they contacted were not willing to provide benches. So in the end, although children were empowered by this project and proud of what they achieved on their own, they were also quite disappointed that adults did not deliver their promises. In her forthcoming work on the framing of children's participatory rights in the UNCRC, Afuatuam Danso Imo observes that although participation is one of the 4 central principles of the Convention, it still remains a gift from adults to children, and adults are the ones who decide, quote, who participates, how they participate, the topics on which they participate, and ultimately the outcome of participatory initiatives, unquote. And that is certainly visible in this particular case study. So looking at this final photograph, which was taken after the project received an honorable mention in the competition and children finally gained official adult approval, the number of children was evidently a lot higher. And this was probably because all children who were not permitted to work on the garden project could finally join their friends. Also interestingly, the man in the background is the very owner of the hairdresser next door, who instructed his apprentices to stop the works. The participating children were neither named on the park signboard nor the plaque, because even Doğan Kardeş listed the school as the winner of the competition and not the children. And if you're wondering what became of the little park, here is a recent view of the same road. So it turns out it still is a park, but now it does have the wooden benches and the pretty tiles. And moreover, it now extends all the way up the road, connecting all the disused spaces in front of the apartment blocks. And I will leave it at that. Thank you.